Quinnipium. Welcome to our Knowing Nipmuc webinar series. We hope that this collection of educational webinars will allow organizations to know Nipmuc better and to facilitate greater understanding between our cultures. Thank you so much for viewing.
The nuts and bolts of NAGPRA. I'm going to start again because the recording just started. So I want to say welcome and thanks to everyone for coming. And what I'm planning to do today is to go over what I call the nuts and bolts of NAGPRA, kind of a NAGPRA 101, and also discuss this concept of what I've termed institutional will and what that means in various contexts. So as Cheryl said, I serve on the Hassan-Misco Nipmuc Band Council, and I've served in various roles with the tribe over the years. Primarily as THPO, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and in addition to working with Section 106 in that role, have also worked with other people like Cheryl and other tribal members on NAGPRA. So primarily with the goal of returning our ancestors and getting them back. So we are going to have some interactive moments in this webinar rather than just talk at you for 30 to 40 minutes. I'm going to be asking you a few questions. We might have time certainly for a Q&A later because I'll be going through this rather quickly, and NAGPRA can be a fairly complicated law, so I want to make sure that if anybody has questions, we can answer them. And also I have some moments in the presentation where I'd like to stop and just be reflective as a group. So I think we'll use the chat function for that. So the concept of institutional will. Do you see my second slide, Cheryl? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thanks for all your help with my tech unsavviness. So I'll be talking about this concept of institutional will, very specifically in NAGPRA. What does that mean, and how can it be achieved by institutions? And when we say institutions in the law, they're defined as museums. It also refers to institutions of higher ed, and primarily we'll be looking at larger universities. So it can apply to institutions that are both universities and colleges. And we'll be talking very specifically about some universities from this area of Southern New England. So in the academy, beyond just doing NAGPRA for an institution, what that might mean, beyond returning ancestors and being in compliance, how we might think about this as academics and as teachers and learners, and also in our work and our relationships as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who are very committed to doing this work. So just very briefly introducing myself, as we've kind of already said, I've had many hats for the tribe, again, primarily as THPO. I've also been working over the years on an architectural restoration project of a homestead that is now on the National Register as of 2011. The homestead on the Hassan-Misco Reservation, have served as NAGPRA representative. I also worked on the research team trying to help the tribe achieve federal acknowledgement for several decades. I've served as a tribal researcher and archivist, also oversaw an oral history project. And I'm an academic. I have a PhD in anthropology, presently at Brown, as Cheryl said, helping to build Native American Indigenous studies here, and have done genealogy and museum work for the tribe, as well as other miscellaneous responsibilities as called upon. So we all have many hats that we wear. For anyone here who is not tribal and local, and even if you are, this is a map that we've seen. I believe Cheryl had it in one of her presentations recently. It's not our favorite map for several reasons. It has these very clearly demarcated territories, or these lines that split what we now call homelands. We don't necessarily think of ourselves that way, but when we look at Southern New England, these are the primary tribal groups that have and still do exist throughout this region. So I share this for those who may not be aware of it, and also because this is going to be a publicly available presentation after this afternoon on our website. So it's always good information to share. And there we see Nipmuc homelands squarely in the center there. Our homelands are central Massachusetts, Northeast Connecticut, and Northwest Rhode Island. Many of us also have relatives, kin, and ancestry that tied to other tribes, and in particular, the Narragansett. So I share that with you just just kind of as information and a backdrop for what we'll talk about in terms of Southern New England today. So we'll be talking about NAGPRA. What is NAGPRA, right? Again, a very complicated, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. It could be a very simple law. It is, as Cheryl said, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was passed in 1990. So if I'm doing my math correctly, we are 33 years into this law. And you'll see a little bit later in the presentation how many thousands of ancestors just in this immediate area, just looking at a few institutions, are still sitting there waiting to be returned. I also share the website for National NAGPRA. I checked this earlier. It does still work, and invite you to go to the website of National NAGPRA. It is always the best source for really understanding the law in a deeper way, I guess. And it's very, very user friendly. They basically updated it recently. It has a glossary, so if you don't understand a term, you can actually go there and read it. And many of the things that I'll be sharing this afternoon are taken right from the National NAGPRA website. What I like about the National NAGPRA website is when you open it, it makes it really, really clear what the purpose of the law is and what the purpose of this federal agency that is part of the National Park Service is. Their goal is facilitating respectful return. So if there's ever a conversation about, what NAGPRA is, what its goal is, if it, is a process, or if it is, a set of steps to follow, the bottom line, as far as I can see, and which I think is very much aligned with National NAGPRA, the federal agency, is that they have always overseen a law that we understand exists to facilitate return of ancestors and other objects. So further defining what is NAGPRA, again, it's a federal law. And as I said, first passed in 1990. So again, 33 years in. And I underscore federal here to share with you that it only applies to the United States, and therefore the 50 states. Right. So, for example, if an institution in Canada or Mexico or overseas had ancestors that were Native American or objects that a tribe felt should be returned, they unfortunately would not be able to use NAGPRA to get those back. There is, as of present, no international law. There are people constantly working on this. There might be guidelines, but there is no law to facilitate international returns. So we pretty much are only talking about the 50 states within the United States. NAGPRA also provides a process, and I underscore process because I guess, say very clearly that NAGPRA does not dictate an outcome. If an institution or if a tribe engages in this law, it does not mean that the final outcome will be that things will be returned to the tribes. And we'll kind of look at that a little bit more closely in a few slides. So a process for determining the rights of lineal descendants, so people who are directly descendant from an individual or an object that an individual may have owned, can also go through NAGPRA. It's not just for larger tribes. So lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and it also applies to Native Hawaiian organizations, shortened to NHOs, who can claim or seek to claim or seek to repatriate human remains. So there's 4 different object categories here, for lack of a better term: human remains, 2 different types of funerary objects, what are known as sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And we'll be looking at each of these, the definitions of each of these in a minute, with which they are culturally affiliated. This is a term that has been certainly one that has caused a lot of conversation, shall we say, in the field of NAGPRA and museums and with tribes. To be culturally affiliated has meant that there needs to be a demonstrated connection between the ancestors and or the objects that a tribe is seeking to get back and modern day existing tribes. So there has to be some type of a connection through time. If something or an ancestor is 400 or 500 years old, you can imagine that if there's an institution that isn't as supportive of NAGPRA, that they may find it easier to say that there is a connection with something that's 400 or 500 years old, as opposed to something that's 4,000 or 5,000 years old. And we'll talk a little bit about those complexities in a minute as well. So defining these terms, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here. I'm happy to go back to any of these if anyone would like. I think it's worth having them in the presentation, also because this will be recorded and saved for future educational purposes. So it is good to kind of go through these. So human remains, a starting point is that they have to be clearly identified as Native American. And that's actually a really important component to this law. Again, say we had ancestors that were 400 or 500 years old. They could be Native American, but they might not be, right? Because we know that there are other people here at that time. So being able to say that for various reasons, whether it's because they were analyzed by a physical anthropologist or because there were other materials in the burial with them, when we look at human remains, we have to be able to say with some certainty that we feel like they were Native American. Funerary objects. So these fall into two categories: associated and unassociated. Associated funerary objects, and again, I'm not going to spend too much time on these because it's kind of getting in the weeds, but basically these are known to have come from a specific burial context and associated with human remains that are in the possession of a museum or agency. It doesn't necessarily mean that both the ancestor or the human remains and the funerary objects are together, like say in the same box or even in the same room or even at the same institution. These could be at two separate institutions, right? But documentation clearly shows that the human remains and those funerary objects went together at some point and came out of the same burial. So that's how we define associated funerary objects. And that's why I put a museum or agency, because it doesn't mean that they have to be with the same museum or agency. Unassociated funerary objects are either known with certainty or the evidence points to the fact that they are believed to be from a burial context, but the human remains are not in the possession of a museum or agency. In other words, the ancestors and these materials from the burial got separated at some point, often a long time ago. If you've ever read the book Skull Wars by David Hurst Thomas, you know that there was a lot of trading of body parts and objects from graves. So it is not uncommon at all that things got separated. There were no paper trails. People didn't keep track of these things. People were researching left femurs. So there was a situation once where an institution I was at had 17 left femurs, because the scientist there was looking at growth patterns of males from this time period. So, you know, there are many cases where a tribe sees a particular object and they say, we've only ever seen this in a burial context. And we're telling you, we firmly believe that this is a burial object, even though there's no other documentation that you have that demonstrates this. So we're going to say that this is a funerary object, but because we don't know the context, we would call it an unassociated funerary object. An item of, oh, I skipped one, excuse me. Further defining terms, sacred items. So sacred items, again, this is cut and paste exactly from the glossary from the National NAGPRA website. These are specific ceremonial objects needed by traditional Native American religious leaders for the practice of traditional Native American religions by their present day adherents. And you'll see that I added emphasis here to specific words. I'd like to take a minute here while we can, and in the chat, if you could share one or two thoughts that you have about why I might have highlighted those words and what potential problems or obstacles you might see with this very specific definition of what a sacred item is. And I can actually see the chat, Cheryl. I won't have time to read all of these. We can also go back to this later. Multiple definitions or ideas of traditional. Yes. So what we're seeing here is something defined as being connected to traditional indigenous practices, but who defines what is traditional, right? Problems could be that there's no documentation on traditional religions or no longer practiced due to genocide. Exactly. So here we have indigenous people today, right, who might have very melded or different cultural practices. And here I've given 3 examples of 3 objects, well, 3 in 1. So altogether there's 5 objects that could be easily defined as sacred objects. We have pipes, which were used for, and still are, right, have been over time used for ceremonial purposes. In the middle, that's something that when you say you opened a drawer in a museum, you might not automatically think that was a sacred object, but that's actually a pipe bag. So that would be very closely connected to the protection of those sacred objects, the pipes, and in and of itself might also be defined as a sacred object by a tribe. And to my far right, we have a rosary. So that is not something that if you saw in a museum collection, you would automatically think, oh, that's a sacred Native American object, right? But knowing, especially here in the East, as with our tribe, that Native people have practiced, at the very least, a melded form of religion, if not Christianity wholeheartedly. This religion is very much part of the practices of Native people for at least the last 400 years, we know. So I highlight these, and I use highlight. I apologize. I saw somebody said I can't see the highlights, so they're italicized. So I've emphasized certain words like traditional and present day. And that in this definition, we can see that there is an understood connection between what we understand to be traditional, going back into time, reaching back into time, right, and present day. And almost this expectation that Native people need to have been static, right? And there's also the issue that if a sacred object, for example, has been separated from tribal people and been held in a museum, and we didn't have access to it, how are we expected to continue our religious practices if we didn't have these objects in our possession and they've been sitting in a museum? So you can kind of already get a sense of, well, the definitions are pretty straightforward. And I actually think the process part of the law is pretty straightforward. It can be very complicated. And then you can have indigenous people interpreting this, and then you can have non-indigenous people who maybe work for institutions also adding their interpretations on this. And if they don't have institutional will and have a retentive philosophy, that could be extremely complicated. And that is a kind way of saying that they might not want to give the objects back. So when we look at the definition of an item or items of cultural patrimony, again, right from National NAGPRA, we see that they define these as being objects having ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to the Native American group, rather than property owned by an individual Native American, and which therefore cannot be alienated, appropriated, or conveyed by any individual. Cannot be, in other words, cannot be separated from the group by an individual. And this is really important because there are many cases where something was conveyed to a museum, for example, through an anthropologist who was on a collecting frenzy in, say, the 1800s. And sometimes a leader of the tribe, say the person represented themselves as a chief and was recognized, in fact, as a chief by the rest of the tribe. They may have given something to an anthropologist that ended up in a museum. And there was one case that went before the National NAGPRA Review Committee, in fact, where there was even a deed of gift from this individual. And what this definition is telling us is that if something is important to the entire group, that even an individual, say with authority, like a tribal leader or a chief, if they conveyed that away from the group, they never would have had the authority to do that. They should not have ever done that. So it should not have been separated because it was understood to be of importance to the entire group. Can anyone think of a similar type of object that we as Americans might think, you know, if our president wanted to give this away to another country, Americans might be up in arms. So something that we might consider to have similar importance to us as a collective and think of as an item of cultural patrimony. If you can think of an example, drop that in the chat. I see something up there. The Declaration of Independence. That's an excellent, excellent example. The Liberty Bell, the Statue of Liberty. Yes, those are really, really good examples. Things that, again, so you can really easily, I think, get your head around this concept of what an item of cultural patrimony would be or could be. Okay, who must comply with this law? All federal agencies must comply with NAGPRA. And I can tell you from some of the meetings that I've been at and just some of the evidence that I've seen that federal agencies indeed can be the worst offenders. They did not always keep good records. They have what are called split collections. Some are with one agency and some are with another. Some are managed by one, but stored in the holdings or the storage facilities of another agency. Some are stored with museums, but actually owned by the federal agencies. So federal agencies in particular have the responsibility of returning still thousands and thousands of ancestors, last I knew. All public and private museums, I capitalized museums and then put in parentheses institutions, because even if an institution that receives federal funds, like an educational institution such as a university or college, if they receive federal funds, they are defined according to this law as a museum. So they might not call themselves a museum because they are a university or a college, but they are defined as such and must comply with NAGPRA if they receive in any way federal funds. The Smithsonian Institution is not subject to NAGPRA because a year before NAGPRA was passed in 1989, there was pretty much a trial law that was enacted through the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which became pretty much the prototype for NAGPRA. So the Smithsonian became the guinea pig for seeing if a law could pass, and they were also one of the biggest holders of Native American ancestors and objects. So the thinking at that time throughout I think the good 10 years before the Smithsonian Act was passed, was that if we can get the Smithsonian to comply, then we can go after others, in relatively larger or smaller institutions like universities and colleges and other museums. So how does the law work? It's, again, I'm simplifying it and kind of streamlining it, this process that federal agencies and museums/institutions identify items in their collections that would be, quote, subject to NAGPRA. And I put that in quotes because that's one of kind of, again, the sticky areas, I think, of this law, that what an institution might decide independently is subject to NAGPRA could be very different than, say, what a tribe might think is subject to NAGPRA. So the proper way to do this is not to decide like, oh, well, this couldn't possibly be a sacred object or an object of cultural patrimony because it's in our collection. So we'll just say that it's not subject to NAGPRA. The way that I have approached this and have encouraged institutions to approach this is to say anything of Native American origin that was not bought as part of, say, the art marketplace, in other words, made for consumer consumption, or bought at a powwow, if it was collected in any way through archaeology or through other means, through trade, through an anthropologist, then you should consult with the tribe to determine that it is not subject to NAGPRA and assume that it might be. So in other words, take a proactive approach. Once the list of objects and ancestors that are in the collection are identified, then inventories are prepared. Inventories are prepared for the ancestors and those associated funerary objects that we know go with an ancestor somewhere. And the summaries are made for anything that could potentially be an object of cultural patrimony, a sacred object, or an unassociated funerary object. So we have kind of these two categories, inventories and summaries. And those are done in consultation. So all of this should be in conversation from the beginning with, if it's appropriate, lineal descendants. If you know, in other words, if you know that an object or even human remains directly relate to a family line, talk to those individuals first. If not, and you have reason to believe, usually by geographical location, that they're connected to a tribe or tribes, then consult with those people through the official representatives, and again, Native Hawaiian organizations, to determine cultural affiliation. And then publish the findings in the register, either through a notice of inventory completion for the inventories or a notice of intent to repatriate, if there's feedback from the summaries that something is, or a tribe believes that it's a sacred object of cultural patrimony, or in an associated funerary object. The end result is repatriation. So here I've done all of this in a little over 20 minutes and walked you through the process, the nuts and bolts of the law, and everything seems like it should be pretty streamlined and easy. The final step is a physical transfer of the ancestors and or objects, meaning that papers are signed, they leave the institution, the tribal representatives arrive and take them home and do whatever they're going to do on their own. And this all seems quite simple, but what problems could possibly arise? I want to briefly go through some of the complexities of NAGPRA. Some of these you may have already thought about, or you may have actually experienced them yourself. We'll start with at the museum or institutional level. One of the, I think, really apparent issues is that this technically only applies to institutions that receive federal funds. So what about a small local historical society, right? We all have these in our town. I have actually fielded phone calls where somebody has called from a historical society with literally a skeleton in the closet. One of them was named Jenny, I believe, and they call and they said, oh my God, we have this director here, and this director had this retentive philosophy and kept Jenny in the closet all these years. He strong-armed us. We couldn't do anything about it. And now we really need to do the right thing. What do we do? So they are doing this basically in good faith. They are not required to. They probably shouldn't be holding human remains. But according to NAGPRA, anyway, there might be other laws that dictate whether or not they can have human remains in their possession. But according to NAGPRA, if they do not receive federal funds, they technically do not have to comply with NAGPRA. Private individuals, it's the same thing. Again, there are local and state laws often that dictate whether or not people should have in their possession human remains, but we're talking about just compliance with NAGPRA. Institutions don't always have, or I would say choose to allocate the resources to comply with NAGPRA. We've seen plenty of examples of this where large, well-endowed institutions have not taken the time to complete their NAGPRA obligations. And as I said before, we are 33 years into this law, and the fact that there are still ancestors sitting in drawers or sitting in vaults, sitting in boxes is really something that can be really hard to comprehend. Like, why has it taken this long? When institutions point to the fact that, oh, we don't have the resources, it simply means that they're choosing to put their resources in other areas. The process, though, even when institutions do act in good faith, can often take years or decades. Often the consultation process, it should be done slowly and carefully. So that might take, a number of years. It shouldn't take decades. It might take decades to consult with and with the appropriate tribes and individuals and repatriate your entire collection, but a single consultation should not take decades. It should perhaps maybe take a year or two, if again, the resources are allocated to do it. Some institutions still do physical anthropology, right? They still study human remains, and they understand that they are valuable resources, and I'm certainly not arguing with that. Can we tell a lot from human remains about the past? Yes, we certainly can. But if this research is done not in consultation or with the support and the blessing of the tribal people whose ancestor that is, then it's just completely inappropriate. And there's no other way to really look at this. Some scientists, archaeologists, still see human remains as scientific resources that need study. And they've actually said in some cases, losing them would be like burning books, like we'd be losing all of this valuable knowledge. And we can't afford to do that. And they're very anti-NAGPRA, some of these people. Other issues. So when we look at the tribal level, for a tribe, especially a non-federally recognized tribe like us, having the resources and the time to research and investigate like where our ancestors have gone. They might have traveled very far and wide. They might be at an institution in California, so kind of tracking all that down, reaching out to the institution, setting up a consultation, that all takes time and energy. So many tribes just honestly don't have those resources. Cultural affiliation is another obstacle, I would say, to achieving NAGPRA and returning ancestors and objects to tribes. Again, that definition meaning that there has to be a connection to a modern day tribe. And one of the biggest flaws in the law, which the regulations through which the law is enacted are being reviewed and updated as we speak. I haven't been following the process very closely. I would guess within maybe a year, the regulations through which NAGPRA is instituted may be revised. And I think a lot of us are hoping that this part of the law, that cultural affiliation is determined by museums and institutions, might be changed. So basically a tribe cannot go to an institution and say, we're telling you, here's the information, this is our ancestor, and we are culturally affiliated. They can do that right now, but the museum can just say, well, that's really nice that you've said this and that you've shared all this documentation, but we don't agree. Or they'll use a temporal, in other words, a time argument, a time-related argument, and say, well, they're 2,000 years old, and therefore we don't feel that they're Nipmuc because that's just too old to really be that connected to the modern day people who call themselves Nipmuc. We've heard that argument in the past as well. If an institution determines that no cultural affiliation exists, the museums can determine, or the ancestors and or the objects are put into a category called CUI, or culturally unidentifiable. So these are defined again right from NAGPRA as cultural items for which no culturally affiliated present-day Indian tribe or native organization can be determined. In other words, there's no connection between the past and the present. So these are definitely, you can see the law is getting more and more complicated because the law, like Section 106, is written to include and require engagement with and consultation with federally recognized tribes. Culturally unidentifiable also includes non-federally recognized tribes. So here I have this lovely picture from days gone by of Cheryl and I. So Nipmuc are considered CUI, culturally unidentifiable, even if we know that they're Nipmuc. Lumbee, because they're non-federally recognized. A Lumbee ancestor or cultural object that is clearly connected to Lumbee would be classified as CUI or culturally unidentifiable. Another way that something might be identified as CUI is that it's connected to a historic tribe. So we know that this tribe existed. We've seen documentation, but while there might be individuals or descendants, there isn't an extant tribe today, a cohesive group that can step forward and say, we are still that tribe. We are a cohesive group. So one example of this that I can think about from Southern New England is the Nipmuc, for example. So our kin to the west along the Connecticut River. Or there's just insufficient evidence to connect the past and the present. An example of this would be an individual who is too old. You may have heard a number of years ago about a very famous case called Kennewick Man. He was found in 1996 in Washington State along the Kennewick River, or in Kennewick, Washington. I can't remember if that was the name of the river as well, but he was pretty darn old. He ended up, they ended up dating him to, I say close to 10,000 years ago, give or take. So between 9 and 10,000 years ago, and that's pretty old. So he's an example of number 3, just too old, that scientists in particular didn't feel that there was any way that you could reasonably connect a 9,000 plus year old individual with modern day tribes, of this day and age. And I really like talking about this case, and if anyone's interested, and I encourage you to kind of read more about this. The final outcome of this, after about a 20-year battle, was that DNA analysis, so one of the scientific processes, did prove or demonstrate that he was connected to modern day people of the Northwest Coast, and he was eventually repatriated. But that argument maybe is being made less, but it has been a very common argument that's made, that an individual is just too old. Sometimes, though, there are really good reasons for designating ancestors as culturally unidentifiable or unaffiliated. And that might be that there's absolutely no provenience, right? So there's no information that ties or documents the human remains or the objects to a geographical location. This is not an uncommon thing at all, to open a box, see human remains. This has happened to me in the past. In fact, opened a box and there were human ribs there. No note, no writing on the box. It was just a box on the top of a shelf. I knew they were human, but there was no possible way to connect those to any of the other ancestors in that collection, or just have any idea where they could have been from. They could have been from Florida, Oregon, Mississippi, or Massachusetts. So in that case, it is appropriate sometimes to say, we really just don't know. Sometimes institutions, and when I was at UMass Amherst, this is what they did, and I thought it was a very good practice, was they would share inventories of ancestors and designate them as CUI in the beginning, just to share the information until the consultations were complete for transparency. In other words, to say, we want everybody to know that we have X number of ancestors, we're still doing the documentation, we're still consulting, we're still trying to figure this out, but hey, here's the information, come back to us if you have something and you can help us. So they were doing that in what I would call the spirit of the law. They were doing that in good faith to share the information and to be transparent, with the hope that they might achieve repatriation. And that's a very different reason than saying, oh, they're just too old, or they can't possibly be connected to a modern day tribe, or they're connected to a non-federally recognized tribe, and therefore we don't have to repatriate. And we, as Nipmuc people, have certainly heard this argument in the past. Sometimes tribes prefer a CUI designation, and this might seem a little odd, and I've had conversations with tribes when I've been on the end as an institutional representative, but they do this because they don't feel comfortable. Like they want to support and be active and participate in the repatriation if they can, but they don't quite feel comfortable in saying, we definitely know that these are our ancestors. So that can be a reason why a tribe might actually, encourage an institution to use CUI. It doesn't mean, though, that a repatriation can't move forward. So I want to kind of transition a little bit and quickly, because I'm watching the time and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation and questions if there are any. Defining institutional will. I want to take some time and think about this, and I provide examples of how we might think about this, and then actual institutions that I've looked at. Cheryl, can you tell me if the background noise here is really overbearing now?
I can't hear anything.
You can't hear anything?
Nope,
Okay.
I have my ears in.
Okay. Well, I apologize if it is. They're pouring concrete of all times, like right now this week. So I'll just continue and assume and hope that you can hear me. So when we're thinking at the institutional level about how we might develop institutional will, if we have yet to, I would encourage people to think about things like we act as stewards rather than owners. But also it's important to not just use that word, but to actually sit with it and think about what it means to be a steward rather than an owner. So for institutions that have museums, or for a museum itself, this can be a really, really hard shift, because museums, I think, inherently were developed, and people in the museum field think of themselves as owners of things, right? Rather than as stewards. Because if you're a steward, it might mean that you don't own it, and that you have to get your head around the thought of perhaps giving something back and parting with something. I've mentioned this a little bit, that we work beyond the letter of the law, and I would define the letter of the law as following that process, right? Going through the consultation process, saying that you did it, but in the end, maybe determining, well, yeah, there's really not a connection to a modern day tribe. So we're going to say that these ancestors and or objects are culturally unidentifiable and not choose to repatriate. So that would be following the letter of the law. You went through the process, nothing dictated that you would go through the process and that repatriation would be the outcome. So check, you went through the process, as opposed to acting to achieve the spirit of the law. In other words, with the goal in mind always, which I have as the next point, the end goal is always repatriation and returning ancestors and objects to tribes if the tribes articulate and feel that they need them back. The opposite, I would say, is a retentive philosophy, meaning that it's ours to keep and we are the rightful owners. And there's plenty of institutions, as we know, out there that have that. How does institutional will develop? And again, particularly here, I'm talking more about universities and colleges or museums, often in that capacity. Sometimes there's an old guard, often they're, archaeologists who think in less progressive ways, they retire, and that kind of makes the way for progress and more younger, well-educated, proactive people to move forward and help move these goals of repatriation forward. The hiring of Native faculty and staff can certainly help, but the onus should not be on them, especially if they're not hired specifically for NAGPRA implementation. It's not appropriate to ask somebody who's hired, for example, as a tenure track history professor to all of a sudden be responsible for NAGPRA implementation. Institutions really need to hire the staff dedicated to that work. Grassroots pressure from within, we've seen this in the past where students at various institutions have been advocates, if not activists, to move these efforts forward. Sometimes there's a federal investigation for non-compliance. This happened with an institution that I was at, and they really did develop genuine institutional will and want to do the work. And they ended up actually creating a dedicated position to do the work. Bad press and pressure in the public eye of a museum or university leadership can also help to, whoops. Okay, sorry about that. To develop institutional will. So I see it as rather black and white. It either exists or it doesn't. And I'm going to quickly go through a couple of examples here. UMass Amherst, where I worked for a number of years, they really did develop institutional will, and they worked hard to return all of their ancestors. Between 2004 and 2007, for example, they had 10 notices published. They returned ancestors to tribes in various states across the country, as you can see. And then, as I mentioned, they have this practice of at first listing ancestors to CUI just to be transparent, and then culturally affiliated after consultation, and really worked within the spirit of the law and hired a dedicated individual just to focus on repatriation. When we look at Harvard Peabody, Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, we kind of see the opposite, however. Again, these numbers are a bit outdated. I don't know that between 2019 and 2023, in 4 short years, that they have returned thousands of ancestors. I haven't looked lately, but when I did look on the National NAGPRA database in 2019, when I first made this presentation, Harvard Peabody had over 7,000 ancestors just designated as CUI. So, and some of these were from really clearly defined geographical areas. And to me, I couldn't really understand why they would be designated as CUI, except for the fact that perhaps they had a retentive philosophy. They also had over, at that time, 14,000 CUI associated funerary objects. I put, wow, that's a really large number. I've actually been in this vault, and it was overwhelming. It was just a really overwhelming and very difficult experience. At that time, they also had 1,076 culturally affiliated ancestors, again, still in their possession. Clearly an example of an institution that has had a retentive philosophy versus having the institutional will to get this work done in the way that it needs to get done. We hope that is changing and or has changed with this institution, and that we see their vaults emptied. The other example that I look at is Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. The fact that the archaeological material dealing with human remains is or was in a museum of natural history, I don't know that it's been renamed, is very telling right there. Again, when I looked at the database a few years ago, they had 373 CUI ancestors and 727, so kind of a flip of CUI associated funerary objects. So they had a lot of associated funerary objects at that time, and almost 400 culturally affiliated ancestors that still had not gone. And I just want to, in my closing remarks, want to talk a little bit beyond institutional, beyond, you know, the museum part of institutions that hold the ancestors and the objects, and talk about how institutional will can be more than, can and should be and needs to be more than NAGPRA, right? We need to ask ourselves, you know, how and what do we teach when we're in the classroom, right? What are we teaching the next generation of people who are going to do this work, whether it's policy making, whether it's, you know, they're going to be in anthropology or in archaeology or history or an American studies professor or work in a museum studies program, or actually, you know, be a professional and not just in the academy. And we also need to consider the ethics of both the collecting and the teaching, right? That if we're not teaching people about these ethics, it is unethical, right? That we need to actually make sure that they understand if somebody is going to go into the museum field, for example, and I've been invited to talk to museum studies classes who never have even heard about NAGPRA. So they're going to go into a field where these collections may well exist and they don't even know that there might be Native American ancestors there, right? So I think we have an ethical responsibility to think about this as those, you know, for those of us who are in the academy. There are other ways to do it, like we can build institutional will through research and academic engagement, right? It moves beyond NAGPRA. Some of our work might not just be about repatriation, but thinking generally about how do we support Indigenous people and tribes and, you know, these communities. And if we look at the NASA, the Native American Indigenous Studies Association website, we see that on the opening slide, it says scholarship serving Indigenous people. So if we're always thinking about our work as serving that end goal when we're in the academy and we're involved, you know, in any course or research or teaching or project that involves Native people, we're always first asking ourselves, you know, how does this serve them rather than us, and not being extractive. We can also seek to meld the academy. We can do this in really fun ways. And here we have a comic that was developed as part of a class, actually. So here we're melding the academy with the work that needs to be done to educate as scholars and tribal activists. So this comic actually has had a really wide distribution, and it's made a lot of headway in telling the stories, both the trials and the tribulations, and, you know, some of the successes of NAGPRA through these very specific cases that are detailed in this. But it's kind of a lighter way, I think, of addressing what can be seen as a very difficult topic. And I just want to take some time and talk about the concept of institutional will, maybe as a collective in the time that we have, and or answer questions. And, you know, if you're in the academy, or if you're a student, or if you're still learning, or you have reason to think about NAGPRA collections, here we see baskets, we see people saying, oh my God, we've got these beautiful baskets, but asking ourselves first, you know, should we have these baskets? Whose baskets are these? What do these baskets mean? Who's connected to these baskets? Whose history, you know, are these objects? They're not mine if they're not connected to me and my tribe. And ask you, you know, what does it mean for you? And if you're in a situation where you can ask these questions and learn more, I invite you to do that. And then I just wanted to share, there is a whole YouTube video series that National NAGPRA has put out. It's pretty much an educational series. Last I know, I believe it's 8 videos, and it goes through the very basics of NAGPRA and talks about different components of the law. And it's a really, really good resource. And I can put this link in the chat so that anybody can cut and paste it from there. So I am going to stop sharing now and am happy to have conversation with anybody, answer any questions. I know I just shared a lot of information. So if anybody has questions to begin with, and I'll also be looking at the chat here about the slides being available. Yes, we have that. Does this apply to institutions in the United States that have objects taken from federal, state recognized tribes, or would this apply to US who have these objects taken indigenous communities who are not? Okay, does not apply to indigenous people from other parts of the world. This is a question from Emma. Thank you for asking this. This is a really good question. So a US institution that has, say, something from Maori people, it's not subject to NAGPRA. It's just US tribes, federally recognized first. There is also a course, a way to repatriate to non-federally recognized tribes as well. So that is an option that you can repatriate to just non-federally recognized tribes. Does that answer all of your questions, Emma? Okay. Shelley, you have your hand up.
I have a question. So you just mentioned there's a way that you can repatriate to non-federally recognized tribes. Can you speak more on that process?
Sure. It's kind of the same process, except they have to, so an institution, when I say they, needs to demonstrate support from the closest federally recognized tribes who may have an interest. So for example, in Nipmuc territory, that might be the Wampanoag tribes most closely, depending on the geographic region. It could include a letter from Narragansett, Mohegan as well. So it does require a little bit more work on the institution's part, but it is quite possible. And we actually had a repatriation just to Nipmuc recently through that process. And then it goes before the NAGPRA review committee. But then otherwise, it pretty much follows the same process. And it gets, kind of deaccessioned for using a lay term through, and then the physical transfer, and it gets returned to just Nipmuc and just culturally affiliated as Nipmuc. So that's really streamlining it, but that is the general process. And we just did this, I want to say 1.5 years ago, if I have my timing correct, with Boston University. So that notice is public information. These are all published in the Federal Register. So there are plenty of, plenty of models and precedents for that. Thanks for asking. Oh, there's more messages in the chat. Yeah, and Cheryl notes that Stockbridge Munsee is the tribe that most often partners with Nipmuc. And then 3 months ago with Ecotarium, a similar thing. Okay, so Cassie's asking some really, Shelley, do you still have your hand raised, or is that just left over? Okay, that's fine. Just double checking that I wasn't missing anything. So I'll try and quickly go through the question here that's in the chat. As far as ethical laws surrounding NAGPRA, how are those laws developed? And is there a way to change legislation surrounding some of these laws? So we have a lot of terms here, laws, legislation. So NAGPRA is an act that is the actual law, and then there are regulations that kind of guide or actually dictate how the law is implemented. So it's the regulations that are being looked at and revised right now. So it would be through the regulations that the changes would happen. And I encourage you to Association on American Indian Affairs, AAIA, has been following this very closely. You could probably go to their website and their social media And they have been seeking more tribal input and comment on the process of the revising of the regulations. So it's through the regulations. So that is happening. It's taken a long time. Also, they are required to publicly report these items. So they must mean institutions. Where can we as Nipmuc people look out for items that are being collected? Is there a special place on an institution's website? That's a really good question. Some institutions are more transparent than others. And what I would hope is that they actually don't have it on their website. So there's a situation where there's an institution that I've worked closely with that has a publicly available database of the collection of indigenous materials that they have. And they consider them to be ethnographic and archaeological objects for research. And I've pointed out that until they have actually consulted with the tribal people, that they likely shouldn't have these or assume that they can have these available for public viewing. So often the way the track is to go to an institution, often it's in the anthropology department, but not always, see if there's a person who is responsible for NAGPRA, and then reach out to that person and say, I'm Nipmuc, I'd like to find out if there's anything that you have that could be considered Nipmuc or is from, the Nipmuc homelands, these specific geographic areas. If there isn't a designated person who is put on the website, I would likely go to an institutional administrator at the higher level, or perhaps the anthropology department chair. Oftentimes these are in anthropology collections, but certainly not always. Or if it's a museum, if the institution has a museum, right directly to the museum director or the curator or the collections manager. Could be different individuals depending on the size of the museum. Thank you. That's a very, very good question. I'm realizing it's 4:01 and I know we were scheduled to end at 4. I'm happy to take another question or two if anyone had one, and I don't feel rushed. And I hope all of that was really clear. I know I went through a lot of information really quickly. It is a lot, but hopefully you can maybe watch this again once it's up on the website, and or go to the National NAGPRA website, which, as I said earlier, is very, very user-friendly, and you can find a lot of good information that's very accessible about this law if you have reason to. Cheryl?
I just have a quick question. So from the tribal viewpoint, if we know that an institution has ancestors in it and they're not cooperating and won't even speak to us or anything like that, what can we do?
I would say, what was that?
Or can we do anything? Is there anything we can do?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably go the informal route, meaning that we reach out to them and we let them know that this is on our radar, that we are first giving them an opportunity to work with us, to repatriate, and then if not, there might be other avenues to pursue. I did put in there that one of the things any institution or museum doesn't like is bad press, for example. So it's not the best way, I think, that we would want to force an institution to have institutional will, but if they have a retentive philosophy and they're resisting, sometimes that's the best practice. Is there anything to do legality wise if they refuse? If you're a non-federally recognized tribe, it would be a really long route, I think. With the institution that I worked at previously, they did have a 18-month federal investigation that was brought about because of a complaint by 3 federally recognized tribes. So you could work with a federally recognized tribe to launch a complaint with National NAGPRA. They do have a dedicated investigator that can sometimes take years for them. They have, last I knew, they had a backlog of cases that was just like miles long.
I guess I remember a certain TIPO from a state recognized tribe that wrote a letter to a state agency, reminding them that they could be reported to National NAGPRA should they not return those ancestors. And lo and behold, those ancestors were returned.
Right.
So like, what is national? So what is that threat? What is that? If I say I'm going to report you to National NAGPRA, what does National NAGPRA do?
Well, that was a case where a state was stating or wanting to believe that they did not have to comply with National NAGPRA because of the way that museum is defined. So in this case, it was me that wrote that letter. We were clarifying that a state actually is subject to NAGPRA. And I went back to the manager at National NAGPRA and we looked at and that question had arisen in other state contexts as well. And it was decided that states indeed are subject to NAGPRA. So I wrote to them and said, this has been clarified by National NAGPRA that a state is indeed subject to NAGPRA. Do you want more information about this? And can I put you in touch with National NAGPRA so that you can understand this law? And that's all it took. So sometimes helping an institution, and I was in a situation to do that because I have some expertise in this area. So I was able to do that. But sometimes it takes like helping them better understand the details of or the nuances or not so nuanced information of the law. And that can work. Shelley?
I'm sorry for another question, but
No,
you guys
it's fine.
kind of reminded me of two things. I remember being on the National NAGPRA website and seeing there were grants for like consultations and inventories. And then I saw in your slide, you were mentioning, I think it was at UMass, there was an 18-month long, I guess, fellowship where you had somebody come on and assist with this whole process. And I guess my question is, have any institutions been successful with those grants, like the consultation grants? Because I know at least at my institution, I would like to have help.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to know like what the process is with those things and if you know of the success with them.
Sure. And I've actually been on the other side and reviewed those grants. The consultation grants are competitive. So National NAGPRA, last I knew, had two types of grants. One is consultation. So you write a proposal and you say, we need $10,000 to do X. We have this collection. We know we need to consult. Consulting costs, time and money. Here's our plan. And our goal is to repatriate. Can you help us, do this? Or we need to do, more documentation and research on our end. We just have no idea. And there's all this work to do. So yes, it is a good way to do it. They are competitive, so you're not guaranteed. But if you get them, and National NAGPRA does want to support as many institutions as possible using those grants to achieve the process of repatriation. What happened at the institution I was at was an 18-month federal investigation. So there wasn't a consultation grant to help the institution achieve its goals. 3 federally recognized tribes came together and basically submitted a formal complaint with the federal agency, National NAGPRA, which was then followed up on and investigated. And it was enough to make the institution say, wow, we should really take this seriously. Like, we want to do this work, but we better take it seriously enough to dedicate the resources to create a dedicated position of a repatriation coordinator, like somebody who's really going to be focused on this and be able to get those notices drafted and get these ancestors home. And that's exactly what has been happening. And in doing that, and in actually, I think, acknowledging their resistance over the years, because at one point they were kind of old school and they had archaeologists there who were doing archaeology for archaeologists' sake, and acknowledging their kind of sins, they came clean and they became an institution that genuinely wanted to do the work and wasn't just doing it because they felt forced to. So, and I would also point out that there's a body called the NAGPRA Community of Practice. So I don't know where you are, Shelley, but if you Google NAGPRA Community of Practice, it's an open community of, last I knew it was around 200 practitioners, tribal, many of them are non-tribal, probably 60 to 70% are non-tribal. And it's a support community for people who have these questions, like I have a bottleneck here, or I've never done this before. How do I get training? You know, how did you deal with this particular issue? I have ancestors from Arkansas. Can you help me figure out who to consult with? Here at Brown, we hosted a gathering. 85 people came last June to Providence to have like a 2-day in-person conversation, and it was all the NAGPRA community of practice. So that's a really, really great resource. And they meet, I haven't been going to the meetings. Last I knew, they met twice a month by Zoom. And it's just been a really, really supportive group. So hopefully that helps you. Is there a penalty for not following NAGPRA? So yes, there is a clause in the law for civil penalties. Sometimes they are assessed, but it requires filing a complaint, the investigator getting to that complaint, doing the investigation, determining that there was a violation, and then assessing a penalty. So it is possible, yes, and thank you for asking that question, Courtney, because that is one of the ways that an institution can kind of, you know, be forced to really take NAGPRA seriously, I would say. I think that's about it for questions. Again, if there's 1 or 2 final questions, I don't mind staying on, or you can feel free to reach out to me. What I'm going to do is put my personal email address in here. I would prefer that for this, people would reach out to me there as opposed to my professional address at Brown. Because I kind of consider this not directly related to the work that I do here at Brown, but I'm, you know, happy to point people in the right direction. Might not be able to give, you know, more of a one-on-one, but you'll have access to the recording once it's on the website. And Cheryl, can you remind everyone again, I saw it in the chat, but can you remind everyone again where you're putting these webinars?
It's on nipmucband.org, which is the Assamasco Nipmuc Band's website.
And thanks so much to everyone for your interest in this. I'm happy with the turnout today, and I'm really glad to see that there's quite an interesting combination of people here. Many people I don't know who have an interest in this. So hopefully this has helped to educate you a bit about this law. And thank you, Cheryl, for the opportunity to share my knowledge today.
Thank you, Ray, for coming out and putting on this very important webinar. Thank you all for attending. We'll see you next time. Hedabotamish, and thank you for watching. All videos are available at the Hatsamasko Nipmuc Band website at www.nipmucband.org. Hedabotamish.